Little Nightmares 2 is a game I've wanted to do a video covering for quite some time now. In fact, probably over 2 years. I already had on mind some of the themes I wanted to talk about and what it represents or seems to represent psychologically, emotionally, in terms of the implied meanings and undertones. And it's very tough to talk about and to cover because there's actually multiple themes, and one theme you could consider as a commentary on modernity and the modern world. That imagery you can see very clearly with the effect of the television sets in this world of Little Nightmares 2 upon the people in it. And there's so much I can say on that, but I do want to focus very much on the central theme, that it's one about relationships, and it's especially about the relationship of men and women. I really don't think that undertone should be too hard to pick up upon, considering the way Mono encounters Six, who's the previous antagonist from Little Nightmares 1, and starts working together with her. The way the cooperative gameplay themes, the sort of gentleness Mono has towards her as he greets her, while she's clearly kind of portrayed as being afraid or scared or traumatized, the way they interact, and just the general stylization of this game, how they're portrayed in this way as very, should we say, innocent, just from the fact of how they are sized as characters, the body proportions. These are still children, and they're portrayed in a sense as children who have, in the theme of the story or in the theme of the greater meaning towards what it's probably speaking about, real life events and experiences, or warnings of bad life experiences that have been had by some in the actual world. The portrayal of these two as these innocent children is ones that are not yet defiled or broken or corrupted by the world. And for all intents and purposes, the story plays out as Mono, the male character, and Six, the female character, as a dynamic duo against the world. You'd very much say the opponent, until you get to a later part in the game with a certain character who functions as an antagonist. The world itself is the enemy. It's just Mono and Six against everybody and everything else as a partnership. And that element of it is, obviously, it's very beautiful and it's very meaningful, and I think anyone with a bit of emotional intelligence would pretty quickly pick up on this theme. And again, as I mentioned before, there is the other theme of the disaster that seems to have unfolded in the world around them, with all these, whatever you call these human creatures that are absorbed into this broadcast signal from these television sets and have been warped into flesh-like monstrosities, fleshy abominations, or just otherwise the semblance of a tragedy. Like all these families and people just become brain-dead lumps staring at the television set, rotting away, and all this life experiences they could have been having together, finding love or finding meaning or purpose or sacrifice or something noble. It's all being eaten away by this screen that absorbs them, and they've just become festering, rotting meat, and it's pretty grotesque. So in that way, yeah, you can absolutely say the narrative is of Mono and Six functioning as a couple, as this it really very much is kind of a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, a guy meets girl story, but in the context of against the world that's been corrupted. But it's not just against the world, technically speaking, until you get to the point where the later antagonist is revealed. It's against the screen. The screen, that this broadcast, that would be the truest form of the enemy that's turning everybody in the world into these monsters and technically distracting them to the fact that they are becoming the very enemies of what we would call kind of the human dream of sort of peace or safety and security, and then of course love represented in terms of mono and sex coming together. Um, they're just constantly being hunted and threatened with death by these warped humans that have been warped by that broadcast. So that story element, it's unavoidable, and it's very fascinating. It's very telling into the minds of kind of the philosophy of the creators that they were imposing into this to serve, I would assume, not as a dark view with no hope of the world, but as a warning. I'd say the psychological meaning of Little Nightmares 2 is that it serves as, if not a warning, then perhaps just a glimpse of reality through a lens that kind of gives you extra awareness, to something to think about, something to wonder about, just to make sure that you don't make any, to sort of give you that movement to question yourself, think twice, and be more careful in your movements and approaches to obviously something like relationships and just the modern world in general. Regarding the screens absorbing people, it would kind of call into mind that sort of concern of, I hate to bring up a character in life who is a real person who's used violence, and I'm not trying to promote violence, but for example, the Unabomber and his philosophy, this idea that technology is the enemy that's encroaching on us and warping us and kind of expelling us from the garden. And I'm not sure I share that view, but I can understand it, and I can sort of see eye to eye with it at times and relate with it, but I'm not sold on it, and I definitely don't reserve myself to the philosophy of violence. But you can see that the narrative is of the negative side of technology, and say, the television isn't just the technology of that has gone past. It'd be the same language of the computer monitor, the internet, the social media, what that does to people, what they end up sacrificing to be absorbed into that system. Little Nightmares 2 is a visual epic story that plays on that kind of narrative and those themes. So you want to pay very, very close attention to these themes, especially as it plays out in some of the major antagonists that appear, but also very much the environments, and especially the general situational narratives. So in the start, you have Mono is alone, of course, and let's be honest, the world is a terrifying place. It is a world of dread, and little Mono is all alone against it. And this is again where I really want to draw your attention to the size of the characters. Notice the fact that Mono, and also Six as she appears later, they are so small. They're not just portrayed as children or childlike and innocent in a lot of ways, but they're portrayed as very small, which means the people in the environment they're trying to operate in can easily crush them or destroy them. They are like, in a sort of animal kingdom narrative, they're the little mouse or the rabbit, and the outside world is the predator, it's the wolf. Or else, if it's not a wolf, it's just a hazardous area where even if, say, the elephant steps in the wrong place by accident, it's still an elephant, it's still hundreds of pounds, you're so much smaller, it's going to crush you. In other words, the adversity and the terror of the world around them, of life itself, is big, and they are very, very small. And despite that handicap, despite that disadvantage, the attitude is one of facing the fears, facing the demons, and mustering the courage to move forward through this journey of Little Nightmares 2. I think there's probably meaning as well in terms of Mono's hat. Mono's face at first is not fully veiled. He has this paper bag hat over his face, and it's obviously it'd strike you as very cute. I bet a lot of the girls playing this game found it adorable and had like that same kind of affection response of that kind of motherly nature that comes towards infants and sometimes towards pets. But I think there's actual meaning there more than just a cuteness ploy to attract people to enjoy the game. For one thing, you can't see who Mono really is, and I don't think that's through any fault of Mono himself or anyone. I don't think it's like anything done out of any ill will or ill goal. It might be a symbol of self-protecting and guarding your heart in terms of if you could see the ugliness in the person, then will you still be able to love them and help them get out of that ugliness? I'm not sure, but I'm certain there's meaning in it. The other thing is that, in a way, Mono sees the world through the veil. If you're going to look at the world through this paper bag with these two holes, you're not going to have the same vision as if you didn't have the bag on your head. You're going to have bigger blind spots. And so Mono is going through the world with this kind of, for all intents and purposes, whether he knows it or not, a handicap. The bag hat may also be a symbol of childhood coping with trauma in some ways, that perhaps in Mono's head, by putting this bag on his head, he's some kind of, I don't know if he thinks it makes him into a superhero or it gives him some kind of courage he wouldn't otherwise have, and that would be interesting in the concept of the narrative of hiding himself from the world, hiding his weaknesses perhaps, or hiding his ugly side, that he feels that he has more courage to approach the world, whether through his adventure or socially or otherwise. But we do know later in the story, of course, Mono will have a point where that hat is taken off, he's exposed, you get to see his face. And so the hat is kind of the default image, the paper bag hat, but it's not the full image. But for certain, as I said before, not to beat the dead horse too much, but there's definitely themes that are being played there. They're very hard to figure out if you're not the writer themselves or the artist themselves, and understanding what shared communications are there and what they're trying to portray. So, of course, Mono meets Six, and as you can tell, Six is not in a good place at all. She's been trapped in a prison and clearly deprived of attention and love and affection for all intents and purposes, just as surely as Mono was. And therefore, you'd expect that this is not exactly an easy relationship to form. There's challenges in it, or should we say easy friendship, however you look at it. Six at first is a little bit afraid, and things don't start out perfect, but you get to that point where even Six realizes they can't go it alone. That functional design is even forced on you by the world itself. When you encounter that chain that's used to pull down the attic ladder so that you can get into the attic, neither of these are tall enough to reach the chain on their own. So you have to work together, and it's obvious the meaning there and the implication would be for sort of boy meets girl relationships is, don't think you can do this alone. Don't think that you don't need each other. Don't operate in this thinking of I'm going to make it on my own. I don't need this other person. And the two working together and putting aside that kind of self-protection and ego, they're able to get into the attic, which starts the journey. And basically the entire game is like this. Over and over and over they encounter puzzles where some of the puzzles can be solved as individuals. They could have done it on their own without the other. But intermixed with these are many puzzles where these two need to both be present and doing something simultaneously for it to work, for them to advance. And that's a pretty impactful narrative for psychology, for life itself, and as a game mechanic, it means that you learn to use both the characters if you want to complete the game. So going forward, the characters they encounter that function as antagonists, these two seem to be very meaningful. I think the first major antagonist is the Hunter. And, the Hunter, his portrayal is interesting in the sense that he's kind of like Mono. He has a veil over his face. He's also wearing a bag on his head. I think the implication is that, since he's larger than Mono, deadlier than Mono, but maybe has a similar form of dress here, is that this is like encountering the adult world that is your own equivalent. This is like, it's not that this is Mono in the future, which is important as a theme, but this is like encountering a hostile adult who has the position to function as the gatekeeper between you getting to the things you want in life or the goal. And unfortunately, he's big and you're small. So you're the rabbit, and obviously, as the portrayal here shows, he's the hunter, he's got the shotgun, and he's not going to waste any time before taking shots at you. Consider that narrative in the sense of like when you go into the workplace. As a man, generally your goal is to get an income that is significant enough to get a shelter and the ability to provide so that you can marry, have a wife, and have children. But to get to that, you encounter the workplace competition. You encounter the people who want to sabotage you in the workplace, undermine you, make it miserable, set up little tests for you to see if they can get you to quit, in addition to whatever chaos that might emerge in the day. Seems to be what the Hunter is the picture of, that the Hunter's the first gatekeeper, trying to keep them out of what life has for them. So that image and that portrayal, I definitely think it's fascinating in that sense. And what actually starts with the Hunter is a pattern that is applied to the majority of antagonists in the game, which is that there's not really a way to fight back. You wish you could. You wish you had some way of taking these guys out and just shooting back or taking down that Hunter, which proverbially speaking, every boss, apart from just one of the antagonists really, functions as they're the predator and you're the game animal being hunted. There's just no fighting back. So all you can do is sneak by them. When you encounter what could be considered Little Nightmares 2, its equivalent of a boss fight, the concept of fight or flight is interesting in real life because we face that choice, but actually in Little Nightmares 2, it's just flight. You don't really have an option to fight something like this. So you just sneak by. You operate in a low profile, and you try to not get in the reticle of the hunting force, which is in this case literally the Hunter. In other cases, it's a different antagonist character, which we'll introduce a few of them here. So I think that also is a message about dealing with life where sometimes, imagine we could go with the workplace analogy or other analogies. You encounter these big bads who they're trying to look for something to get on their reticle to shoot at. And the message is that you have this option for a time where what you do is you just stay out of the reticle. You stay out of the way. You stay out of the vision range of the hostile force, because if it so much as perceives your existence, they're going to just quickly grab that double-barreled shotgun and end you very quickly. So consider that closely for the real life impact message, because, you know, if you think about life in terms of fight or flight, what you have to understand is that despite whatever reason you have for one option or the other, but in this context for the flight reaction, and there is different emotional motivations. Not always is flight chosen because, you know, this guy's bigger than me, they're going to just kill me in one shot. Sometimes flight is chosen out of a sort of form of compassion, or, you know, I don't want to hurt anyone. That would especially be more of an occurrence in terms of the feminine, that sort of nurture nature when it kicks in. And sometimes it kicks in places where maybe it doesn't fit or isn't appropriate, but it can happen with guys too. Make no mistake. But I'm talking like a general manifestation. Regardless, there's a variety of motivators to choose not to fight, to choose to sneak by and try to sort of reach around method, and you're going to just hide behind the bucket. You're going to then slip quietly to the door. You're going to slip in. Maybe you bump into a pop can on the way in, and then you jump to the leg of the table and hide behind it. And then, you know, guy comes in, what's that noise? Kind of like Metal Gear Solid, looks around for who the person to kill, and must be nothing, must be my imagination. Walks out, and you just keep going on your way, sneaking by the adversity. Of course, you wouldn't expect in real life that you can always get away from the fight. And that brings us to that point where unexpectedly, after having had no choice but to choose flight all this time, you're given the actual option of choosing fight where it's literally viable, where the gun is there and the roles can have potential to be finally reversed. And so I think what the lesson there is that, you know, sometimes in life, you know, it's like life is this brutal demon going after you, and yet even the brutal demon has moments of vulnerability where you can counterattack or get the advantage, and it's a matter of playing your cards right until the right moment. I think this is something that will play a theme in Little Nightmares too, if we examine it from that kind of dialogue, that this is something that's being talked about. Now, interestingly, as you advance the story, what you find is that Mono has this interesting ability to interface with the screens. And it seems to be correlated to his gaining power in doing this. Like, this is his special ability. We'd say the characters in Little Nightmares 2, they have special powers, or like a kind of a psychic power kind of concept in a sense. And yeah, Mono's ability is empowered by interacting with these screens. And I think maybe that's the meaning of gaining intel, right? Consider in our modern day, we largely don't go to libraries in person as much anymore reading books, but we learn through watching videos on YouTube or a computer screen. I'm assuming there's a correlation to that kind of narrative where, ironically, the very screen that is dumbing down the population because they lack the self-control or lack the mental capacity to sort of see through the veil and actually have the screen be a benefit to them. Mono benefits from the screen individually and is able to grow his power through them, which is, you know, whenever you bring in a theme of this concept of psychic powers, it is sort of seen as a mental power. So I think the theme here is of the man increasing his intellect through research and study or observation of what's going on in the world via the same screen that is the one that's destroying everybody else. And that is fascinating when you consider the narrative of modern social media and the general distractibility, maybe even video games, perhaps pornography, and all the things that are on the screen that destroy people. it's interesting that Mono would choose to draw strength in such a way, to get more aware, to get more stronger. So that plays a role that becomes meaningful, especially later in the game, and it is something I think you want to keep an eye on. Now, just a moment before I get into the next major antagonist of the game and commenting on what I think, or what I'd even maybe say I realize they represent, is I want to have us take a time to stop and remind ourselves of the environment of this entire game, stage by stage. It is a world that could be just best be described as macabre. It is madness. It is depressing. Like, consider one of the very first obstacles you encounter as Mono, even before you meet Six. You have to swing past this gully to make it to the other end using this rope that is conveniently there, only the rope, look at it. Clearly it is a noose. This is literally the object that someone commits, or committed previously perhaps, and was let down suicide with. Or else it is the rope of the trapper that catches the person's foot and snares them to be trapped for their death. The very objects you're using to navigate this dark and macabre world are objects that are associated with death and darkness and dreadful things, with suicide of people, or with being trapped. And you're using things in the environment that are themselves, they're not the pretty picture of a childhood storybook that is comforting and, maximally sweet. You're dealing with dead, serious, bloody, violent, terrifying reality with no escape from it. And you have to touch things that would, I'd say in a very real way, emotionally, mentally be unclean to you if you're Mono, perhaps, or feel dirty or violating or disturbing. You have to just to get to the other side, to do things, just to advance in life. You have to touch things that are associated with death, are associated with decay, are associated with dirtiness, that are associated with tragedy and sorrow, and suicide, murder, loss, just to navigate through this world. Time and time again, adventuring through this world, what we see is not at all the vision of something that is just simply beautiful, like a sort of sublime ivory teapot on top of a fancy laminated oak wood table in a nice warm cheery setting with a little plate of cookies and a nice teacup, and we've got the milk there, the sugar, and the family's there, and everybody's happy and polite and taking their time, just spending enjoyment together. This is a world that is very, very different from any idea of anything like that. And the characters are forced to navigate through that. As well as, I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are Mono and Six, especially consider if I'm arguing that these are portrayed as the relationship of the masculine to the feminine. The boyfriend-girlfriend, the husband-wife scenario, in its earliest starting and earliest formation. Consider the fact that multiple times in this game, Mono and Six, after forming an alliance and starting to get along more and more and doing more and more things together, they have these moments of separation. Sometimes it's just because they encounter a puzzle and they need to have one person is at one point, another at another point, to maybe hit a switch or something like that, where they have to intentionally separate, just not that. Other times it's some kind of monstrous flesh abomination gets between them, and for the sake of survival they had to scatter. They couldn't stay together in the moment. But of course, generally they're trying to get back to each other, though the story generally has you play as Mono, trying to make his way back to Six. And so you go through these moments of separation, but every time Mono finds Six, it's the most cheerful thing. What you get the sense of emotionally from the game is that these are the best moments, are these reunions, and that the separation kind of makes the alliance of Mono and Six working together stronger and better, and that it adds an element to this relationship, as it were, that is very wholesome. And I think that is something that the writers definitely wanted people who play the game to notice and consider the relevancy for what would unfold later. The next major antagonist appears in a classroom environment with, and actually I would submit that this is another story element that is meaningful, purposely used as imagery, and important when you think about the world around you. Just look at it. Notice the theme here of you've got people that are being sucked into this broadcast, into these screens, and they're being absorbed by the technology of the screen. And do you notice the world has become dilapidated? The world is neglected. There's abandoned kitchens overrun by cobwebs and rodents, and plates are on the floor. It's a total world of disorder. There's abandoned cities, or cities that are maybe not abandoned in the sense of there's people in there watching their screen while they're living with rodents and maggots. But the reality is the world around has turned to, it would seem, chaos. A chaos of neglect, because the people are just not paying the mind to steward and caretake the environment, because they're sucked into whatever these screens are and what they represent. They've been absorbed into them, and so that's definitely done intentionally. And I think it does tell you a message of real life, that if you don't control those screens on your hand, and the mobile phones, you don't control those screens on your computer monitor, you let it start sucking you in. When your world around you is neglected, and you're no longer doing your groceries, you're no longer cleaning your room, your bed is not made, that these are perhaps a symbol to you that chaos is entering into your life, and that maybe that's not good. Maybe that's something you should be alarmed by, that even though you feel like you can get away with neglecting for the sake of the screen, that neglect that you think you're getting away with might cost you something precious. Or you might even suppose that maybe that's a symbol of your relationships, your relationship with your spouse, or even with your kids, or otherwise just your friendships with your boss. Or you could say that these two are intrinsically related, because maybe odds are if you neglect making your bed and mopping your floor because you're absorbed in the screen, then what else are you neglecting while you're at it? Maybe these two come hand in hand and are not separated, with one more important than the other, although others might see that the physical is a symbol of the ethereal or spiritual or something like that. So it's not all that clear, but what is clear is that there is a message like that, and that something like that is obviously what's being conveyed in Little Nightmares 2. And of course, consequently, people becoming so absolutely absorbed into the screens is pictured as post-apocalyptic. It's an apocalypse. It's the end of the world. It's like the zombie apocalypse. And it is the literal zombie apocalypse. It's not guys walking around with, they've been chewed out by some human that's been infected with this virus, and now they can become undead, walk around with literal chunks of literal physical flesh missing from them, and basically be a corpse eating people. But that mentally, emotionally, the screen, allowing the screen to absorb them, as stolen from them, and they've just become a soulless, mindless, inhuman zombie living in a human body. Something like that. I think there's definitely meaning like that conveyed. All these, for lack of a term to describe them, all these demonic little kid kind of children around that are of about the kind of most obnoxious type you'd imagine, the very violent and abrasive type. Accordingly, the major antagonist of this point of the game is a teacher. Now, there might be meaning in the fact that it's not a male teacher, but a female teacher. I'm not implying that, and I have no agenda leaning in the matter. This is something I'm not certain about, and I didn't really think about until I got to that point in the video where I'm like, oh yeah, the teacher is it's a woman, isn't it? Is that supposed to be a message? I'll let you think about that for yourself, but I'd encourage you to just take any caution if you're approaching it from the psychological perspective to just not rush to assumptions, because again, it's a story written by someone. They might have personal experiences written into it, or personal feelings, or it could just be a random stylized choice that they actually had a choice and just decided, well, I'm going to do it this way, I didn't need to, and it would have been the same message either way. So you do want to take your patience with that. I think what's most important is just the fact that it's a teacher. And remember, the teacher sits in the role of the indoctrinator to inform the classroom. And to a degree, how the teacher, being the character of authority and power over the student, interacts with them is, you'd say that's going to inform the behavior of the students. And you want to take a close note about this teacher and how she deals with her students. And that way is in clearly a very cold manner. You can clearly just emotionally catch that theme. If you have just the tiniest amount of emotion in you, if you've not been beaten into soullessness, you can notice this is what we'd call a soulless environment in that classroom. You don't really sense any life in the students. You don't really sense any enthusiasm in the students, and you don't sense any enthusiasm into the teacher, or any personal investment. What it comes off as is a very corporate environment, similar to the money-making corporations of the world, where it's nothing personal, it's just business. This is not a teacher who's going to probably treat these children like they're her own children that she had from a husband, that she wants what's best for them. This is just a job. And I just want to be clear, I'm not really encouraging putting a moral judgment on that right now, because, while I might have the emotional leaning at times, it's probably better not to if you're going to correlate this to real life. It is an interesting question, and it may operate in a kind of area where, oh man, I'm not sure about. But what I will tell you is that if you consider that the game writers come from maybe a place like Japan, where their university college life is seen as being very brutal and kind of the end of your, not simply the end of your childhood, just the time you just become absorbed into the machine, so to speak, that there tends to be a theme of that. It may be correlated somewhat to that in terms of the soullessness and the mindlessness of the environment. A very big thing you want to note is that the children in this classroom, they're hollow. They're actually empty. It seems like they're made of clay. Whenever Mono has to defend himself and smacks them with some object, they shatter. These kids, they're empty. Empty would make them theoretically more soulless, more inhuman, and they're made out of material that can be quite brittle and easily shattered. That's something that's neither good or bad. Again, it's not a moral judgment on the teacher or if there's a message conveyed here. Actually, for the sake of Mono and Six, it's good. It's important that, I mean, can you imagine if these creatures or these kids, they took many hits to defeat, they'd just capture them and kill them. The thing you really do want to note here in terms of the characterization of the teacher as the antagonist is their role as an almost inescapable administrator, a person who is obsessively present. So in terms of when Mono and Six are sneaking around, this teacher has this snake-like neck, and their head stretches out through the neck like a serpent to chase them in areas where normal circumstances the teacher should not be there. They shouldn't have that level of reach if they were a normal being, but because there's some kind of fleshly, demonic, supernatural being, they have this ability to be present in a way that is disformed and disorienting, and obviously it's absolutely terrifying and unnatural. I'd say probably most of the meaning for the teacher would lie there psychologically. This seems to be a portrayal as a very controlling, overly present, dominating kind of character. And that would probably play into a theme of like love versus, cold, calculated control. Something like that. And so the teacher, again, functioning as an antagonist, much like the hunter, chases them around. And again, in terms of fight or flight, there is no fight, it's all flight. And so they adventure to escape the teacher, and eventually they successfully escape the teacher and the classroom. I want to be honest with you, I find the teacher very fascinating. I can theorize all day long on what the teacher represents in terms of elements past this, especially since the context of the story has so much of a dialogue on relationship between, Mono and Six. What is the meaning towards that? And still, to be honest, I don't want to tell anyone anything for certain past the stuff I already shared that I am certain of, because there's a lot I don't know. Maybe she's a symbol of when you have, your boy meets girl story and you're trying to get along and form this relationship. There's these teachers of the world that want to tell you how relationships work and what you should think about your potential spouse, that their whole goal is to make sure you don't have a loving relationship. This might be a symbolic character of relationship interference, somebody who just hates, love and marriage or something like that, the person who wants to abolish the nuclear family. And in this case, being a female teacher, that is interesting. However, it is hard to say for certain. So I wouldn't say it as an absolute. I'd say take your time to think about that. But let's move forward into the next series of events. The next adventure of Mono and Six is in an area that can be best described as a macabre laboratory hospital in which artificial humanoid constructs are created and made to function as your prime adversaries. These artificial humans function like string puppets, and of a wooden variety. They're quite durable, strong, and the other thing is, like every other adversary you face, they're massive and they're difficult to deal with. The really terrifying thing about these constructs is that their body parts are able to operate independently of each other, so you can get chased down and killed or strangled by a hand or stomped on by a foot. And I think another thing to note is in this laboratory hospital, it seems like the butchering of the actual original people have a role in creating these constructs. So actual original humans, I guess you would say, if you can describe these screen-absorbed people as humans, are basically butchered like meat, and somehow some element of this butchering is used to create these dolls or these puppets that really just function to extend the will of the person who controls them and to administer control over the area and kill any threats. Shortly after, you encounter the next major adversary who is behind this laboratory facility, who is some kind of demented surgeon or doctor who is basically a demoniac that can run and crawl on walls. And he's portrayed, I guess in terms of story meaning, he he must be seen as the biggest challenge they have up to that point, because he is literally maximum glute. He is huge. He's just so big, and you have to deal with this fellow. Now, here's a point where I want to stop you, the viewer, and have you really think about this deeply, because there might be more veiled meaning here than meets the eye. Because, you know, we tend to think of, when we're going to see something like this, of course we're going to think of like a psychotic surgeon who is some kind of flesh mutilator or something like that. And indeed, there have been a few of these in actual life. I remember a pretty disturbing story about some kind of psychopathic surgeon who did some kind of flesh transplant on someone that got caught in the States, and was really gruesome. However, I would actually submit that you can extend the applicability here. There are people who function as doctors and surgeons that are not of a bodily nature, but a mental one. Think about psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, and understand that if you have and submit a concept of a warped and demented doctor or surgeon who transplants flesh on people and makes warped killer monstrosities and has this disturbing, creepy obsession with warping reality in the way that this character does, the implication would be that you can have an equivalent of this in the realm of mental doctors or mental healers, ergo psychologists, psychiatrists, and therapists. And therefore, if there's a warning about doctors, there's just as much a warning about the people you seek comfort from in terms of psychotherapy. Mono and Six, they end up luring this massive demented surgeon into a cremator and manage to outsmart him and get outside of it and shut and lock the door behind him with the lever to turn on the cremator right there within reach. And so they jump to it, pull down the lever, and thus the surgeon is actually cremated alive. He's cremated alive. Given the vile nature of the surgeon, I don't think anyone's really going to mourn his loss. Interestingly, what you see in the momentary cinematic is that Six is simply using the heat coming out of the cremator to warm up her cold hands, and so it's it's a moment of relief, if anything else. Now we move to the point where we approach the narrative of the final antagonist of Little Nightmares 2. And something I want to remind you here is that up until this point, Mono has been drawing power or intellect through the screen, through the screens, and he's been getting strengthened by it. You know, there's this concept we have in the world, and this proverb that goes around, that when you look into the void looks back. Or that sometimes when you look into the realm of not only what you might find on television or internet, but even in your own mind, and stare too much with too much curiosity, that there's something or someone there that you didn't know was there, that looks back at you. And this concept of the void and you mutually become aware of one another's existence after you've stared into the void. This concept has obviously been explored as a narrative in a lot of games and stories. Warframe is a big one that comes to mind in terms of recent gaming, but I won't get into that now. Needless to say, and I'm sure you've realized where I'm going with this if you're not familiar with the story, that is exactly how the final antagonist of Little Nightmares 2 comes about. That's the exact form they take. Stretching his hand, you know, empowering himself through the screen, we reach this moment where this time something's going to come out of the screen. Something enters Mono's world from the world of what's on the screen, and it's absolutely massive, insurmountable, and more challenging than anything yet. Now, this moment here is pivotal. The man in the screen comes out of the screen and becomes manifested and starts chasing Mono and Six. And I could leave it to you if you've never played Little Nightmares 2 or watched a gameplay video of it to figure out the story, but because I know the end of the story, I am going to just spoil it here. This whole story, it does not end in a happy ending, and that is the kind of the motto of Little Nightmares and Little Nightmares 2. It's not intended to have a happy ending, and because it's just a story, it doesn't need to. It can serve some purpose without having happiness and a good ending. This is a tragic story, so in terms of the relationship of Mono and Six, this beautiful, boy meets girl, boyfriend-girlfriend dynamic, you can already tell by what I'm saying here, this dynamic will be destroyed in the time as the end of the story is reached. And this is actually the cruelest part of the game, that there's a ton of subtlety used here in the sense that before the game gets your hopes down, it gets them up. You see, what's going to happen in the next sequence of events is that this man who came from the screen is going to capture and abduct Six. And he's going to subject her to torture, more or less, in no uncertain terms. This is a brutal and dark story. But Mono will successfully find his courage, and he will actually, not only will he not choose flight, he will choose fight, and he will destroy this man from the screen. He will successfully rescue Six. And so it would appear from the point that you reach that area there that you were set up for a happily ever after ending. And that's where the deception comes. That's exactly what does not end up happening. And the story gets very deep here, and I will explain about who this man in the screen is, what he's supposed to represent, and what this all is in terms of what all the fandom who's already played the game is going to know. But what I want you to understand, that this game has a message, and it is incredibly subtle. The use of subtlety is constant, and what happens that I noticed is most of the people of this game aren't asking, could Mono have done something different? Was this tragedy preventable? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I think this is what makes the tragedy of it so true and dark and unavoidable. To get his happily ever after ending, Mono would have needed to do only just this one thing different. Just one thing. You see, I think the story that is being conveyed in the battle of Mono against the man in the screen is that there are times where you have no second chances. Where when you take up the mantle to fight, when it was called for, only after a fact where it was intended to come earlier in the human timeline, you may overcome the enemy and yet still suffer defeat because it was just too late. The pivotal moment I believe that exists in Little Nightmares 2, where Mono could have changed the whole ending from a dark ending to something beautiful, where in the midst of an ugly and decaying world, him and Six could have escaped to have something special and maintained a lifelong partnership. Where this all goes wrong is Mono's one massive failure, and it's in the first moment when the man in the screen, or the man from the screen, comes to abduct Six. It's this one moment of opportunity. See, what I believe is that at this point, Mono already had the power within him. He already had the power to destroy the man from the screen, but he did not because he was afraid. Mono gave in to his fear. He was so afraid of what he saw. He was so afraid of confronting this character that he gave this character, the man from the screen, the moment of opportunity he needed to abduct Six. And from the moment he abducted Six and got away, this was the end. It was already too late. If you wanted to break the cycle, if you wanted to end the tragedy of a relationship gone wrong, Mono had a mandatory requirement. In that moment where the man from the screen came to abduct Six, there was no option to cower. And I just want you to take a quick look at the scene again to emphasize Mono cowering. Look at what he's doing under the bed while Six is being abducted. Notice how he's putting his face to the ground. He can't even bear to look at the terror that is literally in the process of abducting what would basically be characterized as his potential spouse, you would say. And he's just whimpering under the bed while his spouse is being abducted, basically. I believe that's exactly what this scene represents. And so you see, the story that is being taught here, that is undeniable. I don't think anyone trained in any kind of psychology or psychological analysis or deeper meanings or emotional intelligence concept is going to deny what's being taught here. There is a time you have to fight for your spouse. There is a time that you don't just let the much bigger enemy walk over and put his hands on that woman. At least in the case of men, this is a story. And I guess it's the same for women, but it works out a little differently. With men, it's more physical violence, threat, and the form of seduction is a little different. But I guess it is kind of the same in some ways, where you can say the opposite is true for women. Your best husband can be taken away by another woman, kind of thing. I think that's exactly what's getting portrayed as the story here, and that's what a lot of this is about. That is my personal belief. And, you know, I want to go back real quick while I have your attention, considering the psychological analysis, to the narrative of the rabbits. Remember, the rabbit and the hunter. I want to tell you something, that maybe it's not always about a person's capability in life. You know, I saw this video once of these people who, I guess they're at a zoo and they're caretaking these rabbits. And they're bigger species of rabbit. I guess there's some kind of jackrabbit. They're very cute. And if I find the video, it's going to be on the screen right here. What I saw was that there were these two rabbits and they're like a couple, or they're buddies. I'm assuming it's a male and his mate, but I don't really know how to recognize that. Maybe they're two buddies, but it should be a good picture for the image. And one of the rabbits is grabbed. And what does the other rabbit do? Do you think the rabbit stands a chance against a human being? Do you think it's any threat at all to the human being? Of course not. Of course not. But that rabbit still hops over, and it starts with its little rabbit paws slapping at the legs of this human being who is abducting its friend or partner. And it's doing everything in its power to try to get them to let go of their partner there, or their friend. And so what I think is, even if Mono was not yet powerful enough to just completely destroy this guy, say Mono challenged this being right here, and he gets beaten up, and then Six is abducted. What meaning would that have conveyed to her mentally and emotionally that Mono didn't let her get taken away without a fight? Because she's witnessing him, getting hurt and injured, trying to stop this guy from abducting her. Bear in mind that what Six saw is when the enemy came to abduct her, Mono was cowering under the bed and just letting it happen. Now, Mono does repent effectively. He does change his ways. He gets more determined than ever after she's abducted to rescue her, and he becomes strong. So strong to the point when he finally finds the man from the screen, he just absolutely annihilates him and gets her back. Unfortunately, what seems to be the case is that Mono had already lost all his trust and all his standing in Six's eyes. Not because of what people think, and I realize there's a deeper story about who the man on the screen is, and we're going to get to that in a moment. Trust me, for those of you who've watched the gameplay already, or you've played the whole game, I know who the man in the screen is. But that's the actual distraction. It wouldn't, in truth, if you're thinking about the perspective of a relationship, I think the teaching is, it doesn't matter who the man from the screen is or was or what he represents. I think what traumatizes Six so that her and Mono can never be a thing ever again was the fact that when she needed Mono the most to do something, he was cowering under the bed. Just too afraid to face the danger, and therefore what it conveys to her mentally and emotionally is that she is not valuable enough for him to risk his life. And if you're a man, I want you to think about that. Think about that in the context of your future spouse. If you consider this a relationship narrative, yes, these are two children for all intents and purposes, but this has nothing to do with anything creepy. Think about it as the narrative of male and female. Again, boy meets girl. The fact that they're children is meant to represent, obviously, innocence, purity, that undefiled spirit approach to sort of stuff like romance and love. And the enemy that's between that or against that is everything they're facing down here. That's very important, is the general concept that portrays to all these things unfolding in your life to one day when you're of age, obviously over 18, you marry and have kids and all that. This need to recognize the moment when you absolutely must fight and you cannot back down and you cannot relent, I think that's so important. And what's so amazing about this story is you already know some people are not going to understand. They're going to say, but wait, what you're telling me, that doesn't make sense because Mono does face his fears. Yes, he faces his fears after he first cowers, and that's the point. You see, Mono faces down the man from the screen later and defeats him. The problem is, after he's already been free to abduct Six and to do whatever he wanted with her. And imagine this is probably very much a character, like a picture for sexual abuse. If it's a woman, a female character, a man's abducting her, 99% of the time the context is one of turning them into a sexual plaything until their left is no longer, their left is right and their right is left, their up is down and their down is up, until they're so warped and broken. The trauma is complete. Do you understand me, what I'm saying here? The trauma of the betrayal and the letdown is complete. Not reversible, not salvageable, complete. and therefore it's already too late. All that's going to happen is an endless replaying in her mind of Mono cowering in her bed, Mono cowering in his bed while she's abducted, and then all this degradation and abuse and humiliation and pain and emotional torment and physical abuse unleashed on her. That's all she's going to remember. Oh, but did you see? Mono comes in the scene. Did you see me take that guy out? You did, but Mono, it's too late. That's the lesson of Little Nightmares 2. The right time to fight was right there. But he did not. He did not fight. He cowered. This story of Little Nightmares 2 from that perspective chills me to the bone when I think about it. It's very mortifying because consider the timeline that this is in for men, especially for men. In an age of pornography and pornography addiction and the stumbling block that presents between getting a good relationship. Consider the narrative of all these other men that want to compete for a good woman. Consider the narrative of all these men going out and literally just seducing women to abuse and manipulate, warp, and reduce them to a traumatized fragment of their former self that it's no longer the same. And the fact that if you want that good marriage, how much you got to fight for that. I think this is an important element of what this story is all about. Now, let's get into the deep meaning of who the man from the screen was, or is, or what he represents. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Little Nightmares 2, you already know the story. You know who this guy is, and you've probably already theorized day after day what this is about. And I'm sure many of you, though you have a lot of good ideas, some of you might already know what I'm talking about in this video. Some of you might be just a bit shy because of missing the one subtle detail. But I want you to consider closely the fact of the identity of this person makes it more meaningful. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Little Nightmares 2, I want to tell you who he is and how this story of tragedy comes about. So, the tragedy that unfolds in the story is after Mono defeats the man from the screen and rescues Six, and they're running off together in this scene with like a collapsing bridge, and this big gap opens before them. There's a chasm between Mono and Six, and listen, psychological analysis, meaning in the visuals, stop right there. Think about that for a minute. You have male and female. A chasm is before them. A gap. In other words, from you having that happily ever after husband-wife narrative, there's this chasm. And Mono tries to jump and Mono doesn't know anything about just how much Six has suffered. And he tries to jump to the other side, and he reaches, and they clasp hands. And what you're expecting is that this is going to be a redemptive story. She's going to pull up Mono, and there's the reunification, and that's sort of your happily ever after, your happy ending. Six is holding Mono in her hands. He's dangling on this chasm, and what she does is she looks at him and she drops him down. She purposefully lets go, and she had the strength to pull him up. She could have pulled him up, but she lets him drop into the chasm. And in that chasm, Mono is alone with himself. And now the screen shows the passage of time. Mono is trapped with himself in this flesh world. And time passes, and time passes, and time passes, and what you see is, with time alone in this world of flesh, Mono becomes the man from the screen. Mono, future Mono, is the man from the screen. Now, this is the point where interpretation of the meaning varies, and different people with different opinions and views in terms of not only the general narrative of how and why this all happened, and was there anything that would have changed the outcome. You get different opinions for sure. Now, the most common view, and really what I heard, I never saw what I was talking about before. I only saw this other view that was really talked about by everybody almost unanimously in the comment sections of the YouTube videos of Little Nightmares 2 was what's commonly believed is that Six saw the likeness of Mono's face in this abuser. She saw that in some way they were the same person, and therefore she reacted to protect herself from that. In that last moment, the trauma of, in some way, the future version of the character that she's walking around like a partner with is the same person who abused her. And again, consider that, like, we all know the context. It shouldn't take a genius. It really shouldn't be like that hard to figure out that when you're talking about this young girl, she's abducted, you find her in a cage, and she's in the form of this warped flesh in the game, that you read between the lines. This is probably talking about sexual abuse, right? Being treated like a prostitute or a porn star or a sexual plaything. It's almost always the context when someone's talking about a man abducting a woman and doing something to her that warps her. This is always what the undertone is, and I don't think anybody should be rebelliously trying to fight that like it's some big shock, though I shouldn't be getting angry about it, but honestly speaking, it should be pretty obvious. And so, yeah, Six is looking at Mono in her hands, who she holds the key to his future, life or death. In other words, happily ever after marriage, or forsake him to infinite loneliness. And she sees the face of the abuser, in all likelihood a sexual abuser, of the same person, a future person, and so she lets him drop into his oblivion. And it's a tragic story. So there's so many debates that go on here. So one, the question of could things have been different? I suggest, what I do in this video, that if Mono had not cowered the first time, probably the outcome would have been, even if she saw a likeness of him in this person, because he put his life on the line to try to save her from the person trying to abduct her, even if he wasn't powerful enough, it probably would have been enough to tell her that she had the value in his eyes to be worth fighting for. And it probably would have been enough to convince her that regardless of whatever happened and who the man in the screen was and what her feelings were, that Mono would be a trustworthy partner. That's how it looks to me, that Mono missed the window of opportunity there. But the other narrative is this: some people, and if you're listening and you're a man or a woman, male or female, I want you to take the time to not have a bias. Put away your own feelings. Put away what you want this story to be and what side of the male-female chasm of sorrow and misery you want to justify here. Put that down and look at it and hear the story of all the opinions on this. And you might see something of value, because maybe it looks a certain way of you hear something you want to hear, but maybe there's more of a mystery to it. Because you see, not everybody holds the view I do. And anybody who, assuming there's people reading it the way I am, others are going to see it a little differently. See, some are going to see this as a different story, that they were looking for perfection. Some are going to see this in defense of Mono, that Six is looking for perfection in Mono, theoretically. And because of that moment of cowering and because of the abuse she suffered, she practiced unforgiveness and blame, and therefore just abandoned Mono when he needed her the most. So it's the whole story is very much a picture of male and female being divided against one another and failing each other when they needed each other the most. As well as it's very much about the influence of technology, without a doubt. Like the influence of these television screens in the world, the influence of everything on the television, that is important as a factor as well. That would be the influence of media. The influence of, obviously, pornography would play a role. The influence of, ideological teachings, like all these isms. I think that is all directly correlated to as a message. But I think the prime message, so there's multiple messages grouped together for the sake of convenience to portray a warning or a concern at the same time. But the foremost is probably the one we care the most about. It's the relationship of men and women. And what seems to be happening is that is very clear. Like, what is the undertone of this story? I don't think anyone's going to act like this is a surprise. It's not up to debate. The general story of this being about the narrative of men and women and gender wars, that's absolutely what it's about. Like, that's not me with an opinion. That's not me taking a wild guess. The imagery makes it very obvious. And if you can't grasp that, you simply lack fundamental intelligence and sense. That's not the point, though. What is obvious is the emotional impact of and meaning of the story in the general sense, but what's not so obvious is the nuance in terms of the micro things. What could have been done differently? Who could have bridged the gap? Were they both wrong? Was it more Mono is to blame? Is Six to blame? What could have been done to reconcile things? What could have been done better? What was the expectation here, and who is the judge of the expectation? For example, should we be upset at Six that she didn't dive in? She didn't just pull Mono up. What were they supposed to have a conversation? Like, could she not have opened up with tears and say that she was afraid that she thinks he's the guy who abuses her or something like that? There was no room for a conversation here. She couldn't have asked him about why he didn't save her. So I think the fundamental idea that we're all going to have in our head is the death of a critically important relationship, or genuine, like, happily ever after marriage relationship kind of thing, is communication. If this was something that was critically hurtful to Six, there is the question of why didn't she try to talk about it? Or was she expecting Mono to first apologize? And from Mono's perspective, maybe he should have apologized, but maybe he's like hardened from the fact that he had to fight so hard just to muster the courage and the power to fight this radical adversary that had abducted her, and then to heal her and to bring her back. So it's one of those things where who's right or who's wrong, who's more the victim here, is not so clear. It's like men and women. There's this chasm between us where we could have this beautiful relationship. Who's in the wrong? Who's the victim in a story that resembles a kind of story similar to this in some sense or another? And yeah, for some people it's not innately obvious. And I admit, for me, it's hard. I'm mostly leaning towards that it was Mono's key responsibility, that he was the one who had to demonstrate that willingness to fight at that critical moment, and if he did, none of this would have gone the way it did. But it's not like Six didn't have the power. And I think the tragedy here is, if you consider this a story for relationship, think about this. Mono rescues Six from this guy after first having cowered and therefore inadvertently allowed her to be abducted, or didn't convey value to her. So Mono failed for sure. But after he tried to redeem it by going to fight her to bring her back, and he successfully overcomes this guy, and he goes through whatever process to restore her from this warped form to her original form. And now, because maybe she sees that he was the guy who did this to her in the first place, that it's overly convenient for him if he's like, hey, look, I saved you from the abuser. And she's like, yeah, but you're the abuser, so you saved me from yourself? Wow. Like, isn't that your fundamental moral responsibility? You're really acting like this is an accomplishment, not an expectation. Maybe that's what she's feeling. If you're thinking of a narrative of relationship, the scary part is maybe Mono does all this effort to rescue her, to restore her, not only for her to drop him into the flesh pit, but maybe she walks off and finds another guy and has a happily ever after with him, which would make it all the more miserable for Mono. And maybe that's what sets into motion an eternal pattern of making Mono into this man who eternally, in an endless infinite cycle, is obsessively trying to destroy her and mutilate her, or maybe an abuser of women at whole, seeing her as the prime archetype of all women and therefore fighting a war against women to sexually molest and warp them, to harm them, to hurt them, to subject them to this torment that he went through. And so people are going to talk about the concept of like moral judgment on it. And this will get into higher concepts. And it's too bad so much of the gaming community is so immature that there are words and terminology I want to use here that I can't, because YouTube might SB my account if I do, because our moderators are like children often enough. So that's unfortunate. But still, it brings the point, who was most in the wrong here? And like, if this is the image of, if like, imagine if I'm a man and I'm trying to be that man that woman wants to be, her one man who's dedicated to be her husband. If you're on the woman's side, what are you conveying in a story like this? What am I supposed to learn from it? Like, you might actually have to communicate that to help us, the guys, because it's not that easy to face your demons, and it's not that easy to, should we say, to face the risk that you put on all this effort, but just to learn after the fact you were already too late, and it was a noble effort, but you needed to do it sooner, and now it's going to cost you, and it's going to subject you to such brutal loss and waste of time and degradation that you're going to have an overwhelming temptation to become exceedingly bitter and resentful. I think what needs to happen, that Little Nightmares 2 is attempting to convey, is men and women need to talk. They need to talk about, first, everything this story represents. Like, I'm not trying to make Little Nightmares 2 the focus. It's kind of like a video game parable. Kind of like, they say, how should we put it? Jesus spoke in parables, like picture stories. This is a picture story. It's of what has been, what could be, what is the risk. It's a warning, and it's a CTA, a call to action. Okay, so if you're men and women, a story like Little Nightmares 2 should be causing you to have conversations about the relationship of the genders. And we've got to really assess who's in the wrong and when, and figure out what's the objective system of measuring that, if, and that's the big if you want to have that happily ever after ending that you've always dreamed of. And how do you quantify that, and what does that look like? Is that the two of us are so imperfect, then we have to say, yeah, Mono, you failed me. You cowered while this guy was abducting me, and then I ended up being raped and subjected to the worst sexual degradation imaginable. And by the way, the guy was you, with your being distracted with other things, or with the screen you're watching, with women on the screen. I don't know, whatever this is and represents. Is she supposed to forgive that? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not telling people what to forgive or what not to forgive, or sorry, I'm not telling people what or what not to forgive. And I'm not telling what a person, what their tolerance threshold should be for things that need fixing or are out of place or are broken or were wrong or hurtful. Because fundamentally, I don't even know, to be honest. We're all trying to figure this out. I don't know what the answer is. But that's why this story is absolutely amazing. Little Nightmares 2, for this reason. Its power to create a discussion like this is the proof that the people who put it together know what they're doing. So getting into that, now if you're a woman, maybe it's for you to ask, when the man is reaching out his hand to you and you're the one holding his hand, and he's completely vulnerable, and you've got that chasm between men and women, that big gulf, and in the middle is this terrible hole that leads to a very dark place. And let's be honest, you should either understand or come to wrestle within yourself to come to the realization, you let your male counterpart who's jumped that gap and he's holding on to you now, even though he's failed you, you let him go 100%, he's going to become the monster. Not 99%, like maybe there will be extreme exceptions. Like maybe it's more like a 99% thing, and maybe there are some people who overcome that abandonment. But for most men, obviously, once they're fall into that chasm, it's over for them. They're never going to be, manifesting innocence is never going to come back. And now if you're a woman, that puts you in such a horrible place, because now you're going to want to feel defensive because you've been hurt by the guy, or by his lack of courage, by his misconduct, and you want to defend yourself. And again, I don't have an agenda here. I'm not telling you that's right or wrong. I don't know if it's right to defend yourself or wrong to defend yourself from a guy like that and say, you know what, he deserves to go to hell for what he did. Maybe he does. Maybe by failing to stand up and fight at that critical moment, he really deserves to suffer this. And if he's going to hold on to resentment and then go hunting down women and warping women, or hunting you down, that makes him even more of a scumbag. Maybe that's the answer. The truth is, I don't know what the answer is. I'm not telling you the answer. I'm telling you the possible interpretations and the discussions that need to be happening. And that when you're considering this and approaching this dialogue, but not only the game, but what the game represents, what the story represents, and you think about men and women and happily ever after, you'd better be dead serious when you weigh this out in context of the times, because feelings are beautiful. Obviously, feelings are very beautiful. But sometimes it's not clear if those feelings are right or wrong. Sometimes there is no clear answer. Some people are going to see a different interpretation, right? Like some men are, and I'm not taking men's side here in a gender war. I'm just saying some are going to operate with the assumption that as the woman at that time when you have the power in your hands and drop the guy into the forever abyss where there is no coming back, another woman comes and happily takes that guy and says, well, this is a quality man. Maybe that's, male ego upselling, trying to turn low quality into quality. The truth is, I have no idea. I literally don't know. Like, I have no agenda with this. I don't think anything I'm saying here is going to get me a beautiful wife. I'm just saying I see meaning in it. I see this as the story. And if anyone has all the answers, I'd love to know them because I'd like to be educated too. I'd like to learn the lesson, not repeat the mistake. You get what I'm saying? So I'm just saying this seems to be what Little Nightmares 2 is about. This is a story. This is the narratives. This is the discussions it brings to the forefront. Again, the other avenue that was supposed to be talked about but got overwhelmed because, again, relationships and marital relationship kind of concept, that's sort of the main focus. But the other focus is the debate of technology and technology's role in society. Consider the image that you're portrayed of the world in Little Nightmares 2. The screen is a gateway. Think about that. And it's so fascinating. Like, Mono looks into the void, looks into the screen, and he's sucked into it, and he appears before a gate, and the gate has an eye on it. And it's obvious that the gate with the eye is saying, you look at the void, and the void looks back at you. Like, that's kind of the message. It is that kind of a narrative. And okay, Mono looks at it. The gate is opened. So the message there, theoretically, that's there is that in the screen, if you stare too long, a portal will be opened. And once that portal's opened, a conflict's going to happen and you cannot close it after it's open. Once it's opened, the conflict is going to happen. So then there's the debate that's going to come. Was technology here in terms of the screen, the things on the screen, was humanity supposed to destroy the screen, destroy the portal? I don't really know. I'm not sure if technology is the issue or not. I wonder about that as a narrative. There's a lot of debates on the role of technology in humanity, and not all of its roles are good. The concept of the security state with spying and control and AI, potential AI controlled, war bots and stuff like that. There's a lot of scary stuff, right, tied to technology. So it becomes like, there are morally things that you don't want to say, but as a potential image, you can have the discussion. Like, some people might view it like they were a woman that's pregnant, but they were already given the forecast that this child they give birth to is going to be the person who's going to kill them and kill their family. You'd be tempted to have an abortion, right? I do not promote abortion at all. In saying this, I do not. What I'm saying is that, okay, if you see the technology is the risk is the technology, the portal is through it, do you abort the technology, or is it that you master how to use it correctly and how to control your consumption, right? So get back to the screen. The screen leads Mono into this world where that portal's open, but maybe Mono just had to stop looking at the screen. Maybe the answer's not you get rid of all the screens, as tempting as that is. Maybe the answer is the screens are there, but you don't have to let them suck you into them and into the content on them. So there's a whole narrative and discussion about this, about the role of technology, potentially social media, entertainment, leisure time, right? Because think about it. No spouse wants to marry a jobless loser, but if you spend all your day on video games and watching YouTube, you're going to be a jobless loser with no money, right? So was the issue that the screen is there for you to watch and become like in a drug-like comatose state? Or is the answer that you can master it? And these thoughts, they are very interesting. They are fundamentally important discussions to have. And so that's why I wanted to do a video on Little Nightmares 2, and that's why I couldn't find a way to condense it. I'm sorry, like, this is a long video. This might be one of my longest videos of a commentary I've done. But this game, this story, and everything it represents, oh boy, it was worthy. It was absolutely worthy. So I have no regrets here. This is all I have to say about Little Nightmares 2. And yeah, if you find this video helpful and educational and informing in any way, please like, comment, subscribe, share, and especially consider throwing a donation on my way through the Donorbox link, or helping promote my videos, because to be honest, my last account was SB'd, shut down, and you know, YouTube has done everything to make my life miserable, and I can't make excuses for, you know, sitting around sucking my thumb crying about it. I'm trying to do what's right, you know, do something to rebound, but yeah, that situation really sucked, for lack of a term, so consider helping out if you can. And with that said, have a great one, and see you guys in the next video.